In this clip, we're going to take a look at working with collisions. Now, the collisions are kind of slowing down our scene right now. We can see that when we hit play here. You can see it's moving just very, very slowly. So we want to go ahead and see if we can speed that up. There's a couple of ways to go about this. First of all, we can, just like we did in the previous clip, go to our hair system and come up here to our display quality and keep that either very low or even off. And we can actually show our output curves here. I'm just going to hit Shift H to bring them back. And that'll give us an idea of the movement. And you can see it is going faster. Not super fast, but definitely faster than before. However, there's a couple other things we can do to speed this up a little bit. Now, the first thing I can do is not actually use this mesh as my collision object. Right now, it's actually very dense. So I can go ahead and remove the collision. To do that, I'll come up here to End Cloth. Again, not End Hair, but End Cloth. And come over here and hit Remove End Cloth. I know that sounds strange, but that's the way we remove it. Remove End Cloth, and you can see it's no longer a collider. We hit play, and it moves much, much faster. So we can add a much lower resolution collider. I've added over here into the group this Collide Mesh. It's still fairly accurate, but it's actually much lower resolution than the current model in there. It's actually 4 times less resolution. I'm actually just going to line it up a little better right there. We'll just go ahead and freeze its transforms. I've also deliberately made it a little bit smaller than the other mesh so that it doesn't interfere with the actual follicles over there. There we go. So I'm going to grab this mesh instead and say End Cloth, Create Passive Collider. And I can go ahead and hide it now. And now we'll find that it actually is kind of an in-between. It's not as slow as it was with the other one, but still not as fast as with no collider. But you can see now it's a much more workable speed. So it's something to consider. You don't always need to use your actual mesh for collisions. You can use something lower res. All right, let's take a look at some of the collision options on both our collider objects and on our hair. So if I go ahead and select this Collide Mesh, and we'll go ahead and show it, and I'll actually hide this mesh for right now. There we go. So we can just focus on this one here. You'll see that we can obviously turn collisions on or off, and you'll notice I have two. I have Enable Collisions and Collide. Enable doesn't just enable collisions, it also enables things such as force fields, wind fields, stuff that we're not really covering in this course, but this is kind of an overall on-off switch, while this just shuts off collisions. You can see right there, now it just moves right through it. We'll go ahead and turn them on. Now we have 3 collision flags we can choose: vertex, edge, or face. So does it use the vertices to calculate, the edges, or the faces? You could imagine that if it was using the vertices, the hairs could too easily fit between them. So same thing with edges. We typically, for that reason, use face for collisions. You can also work with the collision strength and the collision layers. We're not really going to cover those in depth in this course though. However, if you're interested in knowing about those, our recent End Particles Fundamentals course goes over these colliders in a lot of detail, and it works identical to the way it works here. Then we come over to thickness. This is how thick the collision shell is. To view this collision shell, we need to go here to Solver and turn on collision thickness, and I'll tap rewind, and that'll usually force it to show up. And if I hit the 4 key to see my wireframe, you'll see that the collision is actually much larger than my actual mesh. I want to bring that down by dropping this number here, and then I'll tap rewind again. That's probably too small. Let's try rewind again. There we go. So now it's much closer to the shape of my actual mesh. Now, in addition to that, I can also set whether this surface is going to be bouncy, have a lot of friction, or even be sticky as if the face was wet. I don't really need to change any of that right now though, so I'm just going to leave these settings here. So not too much we would really need to change there in general anyway. I'll go ahead and hide this now, and we'll go ahead and bring back our actual model. Now let's take a look at the collisions on the actual hair. I'm going to go ahead and grab my hair system, and we'll go ahead and close off Clump and Hair Shape, and let's open the Collisions tab. We'll also close my outliner so we have a little bit more space in here. Now you'll see the same thing again. We do have the ability to turn our collisions on and off, and we have the same flag. We can choose vertex or edge only though, because there aren't really any faces on these hairs. Again, edge is going to be the better bet because that's going to give us a lot more quality. If you choose vertices, it could very easily land on a point kind of between the vertices here, kind of right there or right there. There we go. Let me go ahead and re-grab that hair system. There we go. So we can also visualize the collisions themselves by turning on the solver display here, and you can see they look hilarious. It looks like he's got French fries growing out of his head, but this gives you a good idea of how the collisions are calculated for each one of those hairs. And one of the things you will notice is that they are directly tied to the width of the clump hairs over here. So this 0.412 is directly tied to this over here. Whoops. Escaped from me right there, which is why you'll see that there is no collision width setting. There's only an offset, which is currently 0. This would add on to an addition to the actual width. Usually we don't really have a need for this, but you could increase this a little bit if you wanted to, and then these would appear even thicker. We again don't really need that, so I'll go ahead and drop that back down. Now what you will notice as well is that these hairs don't actually collide with one another. You can see they actually pass right through each other. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is that that speeds things up and actually also gives us the ability to really kind of blend the hair. But of course you can see it's very physically inaccurate. So we can turn on self-collisions by simply turning on self-collide. Now the self-collide also has its own self-collision thickness, which if I tap rewind here, looks identical. It also has its own scale here that can be adjusted. Although typically this would usually be very similar to the regular collisions, which is whatever is inside of our thickness, inside of our clump shape. So generally don't have to change it, but again you can, so that maybe they can be a little bit thinner. But now what you will notice is that things will slow down a little bit. It's not going to be terrible, but you can see it's not simulating as quickly as it did before. However, we now have gained quite a bit of volume in the hair, which can look nice. It looks really silly from the front right now. So let's go ahead and see how this actually looks. I'm going to turn off the display color here. We'll come up to our display quality, turn that up, and you can see it looks very different than it did before. It looks much, much wider, and again, that's because the hair is colliding with itself and it's literally kind of layering up together. What we can do to make that seem less dramatic, like it isn't that much thicker, is we can use self-collisions, but we can use a smaller width scale. I'm going to go ahead and turn this back down here again. We'll show our self-collision thickness, and I'm going to drop the self-collision width by about maybe 60%, so down to about 0.4. So you can see now they will be able to collide with each other, but they're much thinner, so they won't take up nearly as much volume. So it kind of gives us the best of both worlds. We'll have collisions with the mesh, which will be pretty accurate because they're going to be much thicker right here, but the collisions with each other will be much thinner, therefore will only build up some volume. I'll go ahead and rewind. We'll turn that back up, turn that off there, hit play. Oops, I probably should not be playing with all those hairs on. That's going to be super slow, so we'll turn this down. Let that relax down a little bit. You don't have to play too far, but just enough to kind of let this not kind of bunch up on the top there. Okay, we'll let that relax a little bit. There we go. And I'll go ahead and turn this back up. And you can see we've dropped a lot of that thickness, but there's a little bit more natural shape to it now as we actually have collisions, or self-collisions rather. So that's a look at working with collisions inside of NHair.